It just looks like you're pointing at me. Think Timothy Dalton.
Oh, T-Dalt.
Oh, hey, that's pretty good.
Welcome to Random Movie Reviews. I'm Nathan, and today I'll be talking about The Living Daylights and License to Kill. So it's kind of crazy to think that I've had this channel for almost a year. Well, it will be a year in May, so a few more months. But I've gone this far without really talking about my love of the James Bond movies. The James Bond franchise is probably the most important film franchise in my life. It started when I was very young, when I was around 5 or 6 years old. My dad and I would have a tradition where he'd pick me up every Friday from school. We'd go to the video rental place. We'd get a pizza. We'd watch some movies, hang out, eat some pizza, ice cream, have a good time. And he would let me pick the movie. And I remember one day I was just roaming through the aisles looking for something new, something exciting. And I was struck by a cover of a man holding a gun near his face with a very curious raised eyebrow. And behind him what appeared to be a gold naked lady on the bed. I was intrigued by this. And I was like, Dad, this is the movie that I want to watch. My dad, not being the biggest James Bond fan, who's not super aware of the franchise, grabbed it. He's like, oh, I think this is a James Bond movie. It's Sean Connery. It's rated PG. How bad could it be? I think a 5-year-old or 6-year-old can handle this.
Link, say goodbye to Felix. Man talk.
And that's really where it began, my love of James Bond. And it only increased when I got a PlayStation 2, and one of the very first games I got for that system was 007 Nightfire. And then I got all the other James Bond games I could get my hands on. Agent Under Fire, From Russia with Love, Everything or Nothing, which is a game that I'm currently replaying right now, actually. And I've just been a massive James Bond fan ever since. I've grown up with these movies. I've seen all of them more than once, with the exception of the latest James Bond movie, No Time to Die, which I've only seen once. And I have mixed opinions about, but that'll be a video for another time. When I was younger and I discovered Timothy Dalton, I found The Living Daylights to be a bit boring for my liking. I was more of a fan of the Sean Connery, Roger Moore Bond stuff when I was really young. When I started to get a little bit older, I loved Pierce Brosnan and all that stuff. And it wasn't really until Daniel Craig came out and I went to go see Casino Royale in theaters, and I thought it was the greatest thing ever. And by the time Skyfall came out, I wanted to rewatch all the other Bond movies to prep to go see that movie. And that was around the time that I started to appreciate and reevaluate Timothy Dalton's James Bond. Timothy Dalton is what I refer to as the cult fan favorite of James Bond. I know there's fans out there that also love George Lazenby with his one and only Bond performance in On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Timothy Dalton is in that same area where he only did 2 Bond movies, and his take on Bond was drastically different from all the other previous Bonds. He was more serious, he was more grounded, he was more of an accurate representation of what Ian Fleming wrote the character as. Timothy Dalton took the role very seriously, and he read all the books before doing The Living Daylights, and I think he, more than any other actor, wanted to accurately portray James Bond the way Ian Fleming always intended it. Now, most Bond fans know at this time that originally they wanted Pierce Brosnan to be in The Living Daylights. But he was doing a television show called Remington Steele at the time, and he was unable to break from his contract, and so he wasn't able to be James Bond until GoldenEye many, many years later. So they got Timothy Dalton on fairly short notice, and they're like, hey, can you do these Bond movies? And he's like, all right, let's do it. And the 2 movies he ended up doing, the films being The Living Daylights and License to Kill, much like Timothy Dalton himself, these 2 movies have a bit of a cult following within the James Bond franchise. So opinions will always vary with this franchise because the fandom is very, dedicated, and they're very passionate about their opinions on these films. And The Living Daylights and License to Kill are films that I'll either see ranked very highly at a lot of people's top personal lists, or they're ranked very low, depending on what kind of Bond fan you are and what you want to get out of these movies. I rank them on the more upper end of the scale. I don't think they're the best Bond movies ever. I think both films are flawed in different ways, which we'll get into. But I do like them the more I rewatch them, and I appreciate them more. And I just really love Timothy Dalton as James Bond. He really was the precursor for Daniel Craig. I don't think we would have gotten Casino Royale or Skyfall, two of the greatest Bond movies of all time, in my personal opinion, if it wasn't for Timothy Dalton kind of paving the way to get there. In full disclosure, I just rewatched a lot of the Bond movies last year, including these two movies. This was before I had a YouTube channel, and I wrote two very in-depth reviews on these movies on my letterbox, so I'll be reading from those today as we break down these movies. So let's start with the first Timothy Dalton Bond film, The Living Daylights. I often refer to Timothy Dalton's Bond as being the cult favorite of the series. Many fans, including myself, felt that Dalton's tenure as Bond was criminally overlooked and unfairly criticized at the time. Although a handful of critics did champion Dalton's debut performance in The Living Daylights, saying that it was an improvement over Roger Moore, other critics felt that Dalton was too serious and lacked the sense of humor that Moore had. Funny enough, Dalton's performance as Bond in The Living Daylights does showcase a fair amount of humor. Granted, it wasn't as overt as in Moore's films, but it came off as being very charming.
I'll report in an hour.
Won't you join me?
Better make that 2.
Overall, Dalton as a whole gives a terrific debut performance as Bond. He's not only charming and witty, but he also brings a level of intensity that I would argue Moore never really had to begin with. But having said that, The Living Daylights is far from being a perfect Bond movie. The first half of the film is significantly stronger than the second half, and the third act in particular suffers from being majorly overplotted, which leads to some big pacing issues. And also the two main villains in this movie absolutely suck. But Dalton is so great as Bond and has such a strong screen presence that many of the issues I do have with the film don't ruin my overall enjoyment of it. As I mentioned, the first half of the movie is great, and it features some of my favorite moments of the series, such as the excellent cold open and the great sniper sequence. There's also the fantastic car chase that leads into the cello sledding scene, which is something that felt like it could have been in a Roger Moore film, but Dalton finds that perfect balance of both humor and sincerity that makes a silly scene like that work and feel genuinely exciting.
Doc! We've nothing to declare!
That's the cello!
Other elements I enjoy about The Living Daylights include a-ha's absolutely banger of a theme song, one of my favorites of the series, the incredibly gorgeous Aston Martin V8 Volante, which is another personal favorite of mine, and finally, Miriam DeBeau as the Bond girl Kara, who much like Dalton I also find to be underrated. I think both she and Dalton shared some really strong chemistry, making their relationship feel much more genuine than the average Bond girl relationships. It stands out to me amongst the rest of the series. All in all, The Living Daylights is a strong Bond film. It's not perfect, but when it's good, it's really good, and the great Timothy Dalton is the main reason why. Yeah, so like I mentioned in my review, this isn't a perfect Bond movie, and neither is License to Kill, but for very different reasons, which I'll get into. But overall, I really do like The Living Daylights quite a bit. I think the first half of the movie is some of my favorite Bond stuff. I love the perfectly balanced tone, which, you know, Dalton really rides that line of being the more serious Bond, but when there are lighthearted moments in the movie, it doesn't feel completely out of place, or it doesn't go too campy, or certainly not as campy as Roger Moore. And I think Kara is a really underrated Bond girl. Sure, she's not the most like intelligent or maybe the most capable Bond girl we've seen in the series, but in terms of like Bond sharing genuine chemistry with another girl, that one just kind of sticks out to me. And when the movie ends with them together, you almost buy the fact that he might actually try this relationship for real, because they just have really good chemistry. And I don't know, it stands out to me, where many of the Bond girl relationships are quite disposable and very, you know, kind of lifeless in terms of the chemistry. There is a genuine chemistry there, and that does help me enjoy the film. And there's also, like I said, numerous great action sequences. Like the opening of this movie is fantastic, with the whole training sequence where somebody's killing off all the other agents, and the way we're introduced to Timothy Dalton is one of the best in the series, in my opinion. You get to see Timothy Dalton do a lot of his own stunts, not all of them, but you see him actually, like, you know, on top of the car as it's driving, and it just adds more reality grounded gritty action to this movie, which I think is a lot of fun. The theme song by a-ha is so awesome. It's a top 10, maybe even top 5 favorite Bond theme. I absolutely love that song. I love a-ha in general. Necros is also a fun henchman. He has one of the more memorable henchman scenes in this movie with the exploding milk bottles, which is pretty awesome. But yeah, the two main villains in this movie, General Koskov and Brad Whitaker, they are incredibly underwhelming, both of them. And the whole climax between Whitaker and Bond, where Bond is shooting at him. He has that little shield over his face. It's like, dude, shoot him in the chest. Shoot him in the arm, shoot him in the leg, shoot him anywhere except for the place you're shooting him. It was just a very lame final action sequence between Bond and the main baddie of this movie, who's barely in the film at all. That really drags the movie down for me. And when we get into the last act, into Afghanistan, this is a problem I have with a lot of Bond movies, is that I often find that when Bond is entering the third act of the movie, it feels a bit bloated and it kind of goes on for a bit longer than it needs to, and the pacing feels kind of sluggish until we get to the main action set piece, which in this one is great with the whole plane sequence, and Necros is hanging on the cargo that's attached to the plane. So there are high moments in this movie, but the second half drags. They're adding a bunch of other plot elements into the movie that don't really feel all that exciting, and it feels more convoluted than it needs to be. The final confrontation between Dalton and the main baddie is lame. So yeah, it's not a perfect Bond movie, but it is a very good one, I would say. And Timothy Dalton is a major reason why. But I think the reason that Dalton has the cult following that he does is more so because of License to Kill and not so much The Living Daylights. So with that being said, let's talk about License to Kill. Timothy Dalton Bond fans are often separated into two camps. Some fans feel that The Living Daylights is his best Bond film, while others feel that License to Kill is his best. It's important to note that Dalton's reputation as being the first truly serious Bond is largely because of his performance in License to Kill. This was, after all, the first Bond film to be rated PG-13 in the US. And in hindsight, the producers did take a big risk by making this outing of 007 significantly more gritty than any of the other Bond films have ever been in the franchise up until this point. And in that sense, License to Kill was ahead of its time. As far as which Dalton Bond movie I prefer, I feel very torn. Both films have their fair amount of strengths and weaknesses, but just in very different areas. For example, License to Kill has the much better Bond villain, Sanchez, played by the great character actor Robert Davi. Sanchez is legitimately sinister and is overall a very memorable villain in the 007 universe, which is something that The Living Daylights is lacking almost entirely. But License to Kill suffers from being tonally inconsistent, whereas The Living Daylights finds a nice balance between being both serious and lighthearted. I think that License to Kill takes more risks by being much more intense, but that makes a lot of the more humorous moments in this film stand out more awkwardly. And don't forget, this is the Dalton Bond movie where he fights ninjas. Talk about a scene that feels completely out of place in a movie like this. In one very specific area, both films share the same weakness in that both of their third acts are too bloated and suffer from some pacing issues. But they also have a common strength that helps balance out their flaws, and that strength is Timothy Dalton as James Bond. He's equally awesome as 007 in both movies. I just love this guy. He's one of my favorites. As far as sheer entertainment value, I'd say both movies are about equal. I enjoy them a lot. Neither is perfect, but both have a lot of great moments, whether it's the fantastic tanker chase climax at the end of License to Kill, or the excellent car chase and great cold open in The Living Daylights. I will say one of the more superficial complaints I have about License to Kill is, firstly, there is no Bond car. That's kind of a bummer. And secondly, Bond barely uses a gun or even gadgets in this movie. The closest we get is that cool camera sniper rifle that he doesn't even get to use because he gets stopped by ninjas. Most of the action in License to Kill consists of Bond using hand-to-hand combat or evading bad guys, which, don't get me wrong, create some fun action scenes such as the bar fight or the scene where Bond uses a harpoon to commandeer a seaplane. But I just feel that there's more variety in The Living Daylights in terms of action and better set pieces. But as I said, that's a very superficial complaint. Overall, License to Kill is another strong entry in the Bond franchise, mostly because of how badass Timothy Dalton is as James Bond, and both License to Kill and The Living Daylights are, for my money, the two best Bond films of the 1980s. So like I said, both films have their strengths and weaknesses. The bigger strengths in License to Kill is that of Sanchez. He's a great villain. Benicio del Toro makes a very memorable henchman just for the fact that it's Benicio del Toro, and there's times where he can make his face look quite sinister, which is fun. But yeah, the movie is very tonally inconsistent. There is a lot of gritty stuff in this movie, but there's also a lot of goofy moments in this movie, a lot of goofy humor. I mean, there's a dude that tries to attack James Bond with a swordfish, and there are ninjas in this movie, which every time I rewatch it I was like, why are there ninjas in this movie? It's so silly. And like I mentioned in both The Living Daylights and this movie, and this is a problem I have with a lot of earlier Bond movies, is that the third act goes on for too long and it takes a long time for it to get to the exciting final action set piece that concludes the movie. That's the same problem I have with this movie. But once we skip all the boring stuff at the drug making compound and we get to the tanker chase sequence at the end of this movie, that's where the action ramps up. And that tanker chase sequence is one of the best action chase sequences in the entire franchise, in my personal opinion. The death of Sanchez is very memorable. And yeah, I also think the Bond girls in License to Kill are they're okay. They're kind of underwhelming. James doesn't have the same chemistry he does with either of them that he does with Kara in The Living Daylights, in my personal opinion. I think another strength that License to Kill has over The Living Daylights is the plot is more streamlined. It's more focused, and just the idea of James going rogue to get revenge on Sanchez after what he did to his friend Felix Leiter and his wife. It is an interesting plot, especially for the time the film was made. We've never seen James Bond go rogue, have his license revoked, which was the original title of the film. And overall, I just think it's a better plot than The Living Daylights because it's more personal. And I would personally rank these two Dalton movies fairly high in my personal ranking of James Bond, which I haven't done yet, but I most likely will do in the future. Both movies are a lot of fun, and they are films that I've appreciated more over the years because I am a big fan of Daniel Craig. I think his tenure as Bond is very uneven, with like a good movie here, a bad movie here, a good movie here, a bad movie here, and then kind of both a good movie and bad movie at the same time when it comes to No Time to Die. Like I said, I'll probably do a whole video talking about Daniel Craig's take on Bond. But Casino Royale, which in my opinion is the best Bond movie, would not have happened if it wasn't for Timothy Dalton. He clearly was the precursor to it. And Dalton is great in both movies. I think he is one of the best Bonds. I probably put him in my top 3. I think there was a time where he was considered to be truly underrated as Bond, but I think enough time has passed where most people who are familiar and knowledgeable of the franchise, most people understand and appreciate Timothy Dalton now, certainly more than back when he was Bond. So I don't know if these two movies are underrated anymore within the Bond fandom. There's certainly two of the more talked about Bond movies that I see when it comes to the fandom in terms of reviews and YouTube videos out there. So I don't think these movies are underrated anymore. I think they finally gotten to a place where they both can be appreciated. I really enjoy them. But yeah, I just wanted to share my thoughts on two of the more interesting and important James Bond movies in the franchise. And I think if you took the strengths from both movies and you cut out the weaknesses and you put it into one movie, you'd have a pretty darn close to perfect Bond movie. Anyway, that's my opinion on both of these Bond movies. I enjoy them quite a bit, even though I acknowledge that they are both flawed in more ways than one. But I want to hear from you guys, specifically the Bond fans out there. What are your thoughts on Timothy Dalton as James Bond? What are your thoughts on these two movies in particular? Do you like them, love them, hate them? Mention it in the comments below. Also, mention if you want to hear me talk about more Bond movies in the future. And as always, thank you guys for watching.